in the dim hush of Grandmother Estelle's study, as sunlight filtered through antique lace curtains and fell across leather-bound volumes and ancestral portraits, my father's voice sliced through the quiet like a blade. "You're not even her real granddaughter." He spat, face contorted with fury. "Only blood relatives deserve the family fortune." I stood frozen, the weight of his words pressing on my chest, disbelief roaring in my ears. 3 days had passed since Grandmother's funeral, yet already the vultures had descended on her legacy. "What are you talking about?" I asked, though some dark instinct told me I already knew. He sneered, pacing the Persian rug beneath his feet. "Don't play innocent, Clara. Your mother's little secret isn't so secret anymore. Estelle cared about bloodlines. Once the lawyer confirms you're not a Blackwell, you'll get nothing." My pulse thundered, but I steadied myself, meeting his eyes. "Do you promise to keep your word, that only true blood relatives deserve the inheritance?" He lifted his chin, imperious, certain. "Absolutely. The family legacy belongs to real Blackwells, not imposters." And just like that, the lie I had built my identity around began to splinter. My name is Clara Blackwell. At least it was until 5 minutes ago. I'm 27, and up until this moment, I believed Victor Blackwell was my father. Now, in the heart of my grandmother's Georgian mansion in Philadelphia, I was learning the truth in the most brutal way imaginable. Grandmother Estelle had always made her intentions clear. She wanted me to be part of her legacy. I was her only granddaughter, the one who shared her love for art, history, and books. But Victor, who had spent years treating me with cold indifference, saw my existence as a blemish. "You can attend the will reading if you must," he said with a wave of his hand, already halfway to the door. "But don't expect anything. I've spoken to Grant." Grant Mills, the family's trusted attorney and Victor's longtime friend. The implication hit hard. They were preparing to erase me. "I'll be there," I replied, voice steady despite the tremor in my bones. "Grandmother wanted me there." He scoffed. "Sentiment. Estelle always had a blind spot for you, but the law doesn't care about feelings." And then he was gone, the scent of his cologne lingering like poison in the air. I sank into Grandmother's chair, the same chair where she'd written letters, negotiated contracts, and perhaps rewritten the future. My fingers traced the smooth walnut, searching for strength. Then my phone buzzed, a text from my mother. "We need to talk about your father. Tonight. Alone." My breath caught. If Victor wasn't my biological father, then who was? And why had this secret remained buried for 27 years, only to surface now, just before the reading of Grandmother's will? Something deeper was at play. The man I had spent a lifetime trying to please had been nursing a resentment I hadn't seen clearly, until now. I had grown up bearing the Blackwell name, walking the halls of privilege carved out by pharmaceutical empires and generations of wealth. Victor, the eldest son, the chosen heir. His younger brother Theo, brilliant, defiant, had broken from the path, chasing something freer than boardroom legacies and trust fund expectations. And me? I had always straddled the line, never quite enough for Victor, never truly seen, and only now beginning to understand why. Uncle Theo had left Philadelphia years ago for a prestigious research fellowship in Seattle, returning only for the occasional family event, but the warmth of his presence remained vivid in my memory. His easy laugh, the thoughtful gifts, the way he treated me like an equal rather than a child. In stark contrast stood Victor Blackwell, the man I had called father all my life, whose love was measured in achievements and the ability to fit the narrow mold of a Blackwell. My brothers, Eric and Max, were ideal sons in his eyes. Eric inherited the family business. Max climbed through law school with ease. But me? I was always too soft, too unambitious, at least according to Victor, who often muttered dismissive remarks about my lack of Blackwell drive, assuming I couldn't hear. Despite graduating with honors and building a respected career in historical preservation, my successes were never enough. I had spent years blaming his coldness on perfectionism, or perhaps ingrained sexism, never daring to consider that the rift between us ran deeper than either. Only my grandmother Estelle had ever made me feel truly seen. She nurtured my love for art and history, inviting me every Sunday for tea, where she shared family stories laced with quiet rebellion and told me, "A Blackwell makes their own path." Her death at 86 left more than a void. It stripped me of my greatest ally. In the days after the funeral, I began to notice Victor watching me more closely, whispering with Grant Mills, our family attorney, their conversations always ending when I walked into the room. I'd thought it was grief. Now, I wasn't so sure. The last time I saw grandmother alive, she gripped my hand with surprising strength and whispered, "Trust your instincts, Clara. Not everything is as it appears." I'd assumed it was the medication talking, but now her warning echoed in my ears with alarming clarity. As I stepped out of her study to meet my mother, I sensed I was being pulled into a long-buried family secret, one whose roots ran deeper than I could yet grasp. My mother waited at her favorite cafe, a quiet corner of the city where no one wore the Blackwell name like a crown. She looked smaller, more fragile than usual, her tailored elegance slightly frayed, her eyes dark with fatigue. "I never wanted you to find out like this," she said quietly, twisting her wedding ring. Victor had no right. My breath caught. "So it's true?" I asked. "He's not my father?" Her eyes filled with tears as she nodded. "It's more complicated than he made it sound." And then, over steaming cups of tea, she unraveled the truth that shattered the foundation of my identity. She and Theo, my warm, brilliant uncle, had once been in love. Young and headstrong, they had planned a future together until he left for Seattle. "We agreed he should go," she said. "It was the opportunity of a lifetime. We thought we could survive the distance." But life had other plans, and in Theo's absence, everything had changed. It had been an incredible opportunity. Theo's fellowship in Seattle, one they both believed their love could survive. But the distance carved deep fractures into what once felt unbreakable. In that vulnerable space, my mother turned to Victor, who had long admired her from the sidelines. A brief, ill-fated romance followed, ending as quickly as it began when she realized her heart still belonged to Theo. When she discovered she was pregnant, the dates matched perfectly with Theo's last visit home, and she was certain the child, me, was his. But Victor, already calculating, claimed paternity and seized the chance to propose, presenting marriage as the noble solution. At the time, my mother, young, scared, and needing security, agreed, unaware that Victor's motivations had less to do with love and more to do with legacy. The Blackwell fortune, tied up in rigid provisions favoring legitimate male heirs with children, made her and her unborn child a convenient asset to secure his place. The lie became a life. Theo returned years later, married but childless, eventually divorced, retreating deeper into his research and away from the family orbit. I asked my mother if Theo had ever known. Her voice was barely a whisper. No. She couldn't bear to unravel his life, and over the years, silence felt kinder. But now, that silence had come back to haunt us. I sat stunned, reeling as every thread of my past twisted into a new shape. Victor's coldness, Theo's rare warmth, Estelle's unwavering affection toward me. Why now? I asked. My mother's expression hardened. Your grandmother's will. Victor has always worshipped the Blackwell name and its wealth. If Estelle left you anything, he'll need to discredit your claim to protect what he thinks is his. I blinked, still processing. But if I'm not a Blackwell by blood? You are, she interrupted. Just not Victor's. You're Theo's daughter. That makes you Estelle's granddaughter. By blood. The irony struck like a thunderclap. Victor's desperate attempt to erase me from the family legacy might actually expose his own lie, and in doing so prove my rightful place more firmly than ever. What do I do? I asked. My mother took my hands. That depends on what you want. Revenge, recognition, or simply what Estelle meant for you to have. I didn't know yet. The betrayal was too raw, but one thing burned clear. I wouldn't let Victor rewrite my story for his own gain. The next morning, heart pounding, I drove to Theo's apartment. I hadn't told him much, just that we needed to speak before the will reading. Now I sat across from him in his modest, book-lined living room, surrounded by relics of a brilliant life spent chasing truth. You seem troubled, Clara, he said gently, setting 2 cups of tea on the table. At 58, he was still striking, with the same deep-set eyes I saw in my mirror every morning. Is Victor giving you trouble over Estelle's estate? I opened my mouth to speak, unsure how to tell a man he might have a daughter. Me. How does one ask a man if he might be your biological father? I sat across from Uncle Theo, my pulse pounding as I finally whispered, Did you and my mother were you ever together? Before she married Victor? His cup halted mid-air, eyes narrowing with caution. Why are you asking about ancient history now? He asked slowly. Because Victor told me he's not my biological father, I said, steadying my voice. And he plans to use that to cut me out of Grandmother Estelle's will. Theo set his cup down with deliberate precision, his expression hardening. That sounds like Victor, cruel and calculated. He studied me, his gaze sharper now, more searching. What did your mother say? I recounted everything, the love she once shared with Theo, the timing of my birth, the way Victor had inserted himself into her vulnerability and claimed paternity. I watched Theo's features shift, first disbelief, then pain, and finally, a flicker of hope. I never knew, he murmured. She didn't tell me she was pregnant. By the time I heard about the wedding, it was already done. He leaned in, his voice rough. Do you really believe I might be your father? I nodded. The timing fits, but Victor's determined to prove I have no Blackwell blood, to erase my claim entirely. Theo's jaw clenched. Estelle named you in her will. He can't just erase that. He says he can challenge it, claim it was made under false assumptions. Theo stood abruptly, pacing. Even if you aren't Victor's daughter, if you're mine, you're still Estelle's granddaughter. We need the truth. A DNA test will tell us everything. The simplicity of the idea was both terrifying and relieving. You'd do it? I asked. Without hesitation, he said, voice trembling with emotion. I've always felt something between us I couldn't explain. If you're mine, let's find out. We arranged for testing immediately, using a private lab that promised results in 72 hours, just in time for the will reading. As I handed over my sample, I felt dread and anticipation braid together inside me. No matter the result, the truth would alter everything. While we waited, I tried to get ahead of Victor's scheming. I reached out to Grandmother's personal attorney, Edwin Walsh, separate from Grant Mills, Victor's longtime legal crony. I'm afraid I can't reveal the contents before the reading, Edwin said carefully. But I can assure you Estelle was of sound mind and made her intentions crystal clear. I asked the question directly. Did she know about my parentage? His professional mask cracked just for a second. I can't comment, he said. But I will say this. Estelle Blackwell saw more than most ever realized. That told me everything. She knew. She always had. But my small victory evaporated that evening when a formal letter arrived. Grant Mills had filed to delay the will reading, citing identity concerns regarding beneficiaries. Victor wasn't wasting time. He was mobilizing his influence to stall, to cast doubt, to corner me before I could prove the truth. And just when I tried to call Edwin for counsel, his secretary informed me he'd been hospitalized with pneumonia. Suddenly, conveniently, and indefinitely. It couldn't be coincidence. Victor was tightening his grip on the narrative. But he'd underestimated one thing. The truth was no longer his to control. Victor was methodically cutting off every source of truth, eliminating allies like Edwin, and stalling the will reading to buy time for his schemes. With no attorney to advocate for me and no test results in hand, I felt cornered. Until my mother called, her voice trembling. Victor knows you met with Theo. He's furious. Clara, be careful. When he feels threatened, he becomes dangerous. 2 days before the rescheduled reading, the DNA results arrived via encrypted email. I opened them with shaking hands, my breath caught in my throat. Probability of paternity, 99.999998%. Theo Blackwell was, without question, my biological father. A surge of vindication rushed through me, chased by sorrow for the years we'd lost and fury at the betrayal that had kept us apart. Victor, the man whose approval I had chased my entire life, had never been my father. I called Theo, and his voice cracked with restrained emotion. I suspected the moment you asked, he admitted. You have Lena's smile, but your eyes, Clara, they're Blackwell eyes, my mother's eyes. We agreed to meet and strategize, our DNA results now a powerful weapon, proof that I was, in fact, Estelle's blood heir, or so I believed. That evening, I received a sudden summons from Grant Mills, Victor's longtime legal ally. Against my better judgment, I went. His office was a shrine to privilege, leather-bound books, aged scotch, and practiced charm. Clara, thank you for coming, Grant said, his voice smooth as silk over a blade. We need to talk about recent developments. You mean Victor's lie? Or the delay you filed to buy him more time? I countered. His lips thinned. Actually, I'm referring to the DNA test you arranged with Theo. My stomach dropped. We'd been so careful. Victor was quite distressed to learn of your investigation, Grant continued, sliding a document across his desk. He asked me to offer a settlement, $250,000. In exchange, you waive all claims to Estelle Blackwell's estate.
I stared at the paper, disgusted. This is absurd. My grandmother named me in her will. Yes, under the impression you were Victor's daughter. Now that we know otherwise? Now we know I'm Theo's daughter, I cut in, which makes me more of a Blackwell than Victor biologically. Isn't that the standard he always preached? Grant's expression shifted ever so slightly. There are complexities, he said. Legal nuances in the trust that supersede biology. What complexities? I'm not at liberty to disclose them before the reading, but you should consider the offer. Victor is prepared to defend the family's interests aggressively. A veiled threat, wrapped in civility. I left, refusing to sign, but his confidence gnawed at me. Something wasn't adding up. The next morning, the truth detonated. Theo called, his voice sharp with restrained rage. Clara, I just heard from an old family friend, a nurse who worked with my parents decades ago. She shared something disturbing. A pause. Then, Victor isn't biologically a Blackwell. The world tilted on its axis. A Apparently, my grandparents had adopted Victor as an infant after a string of heartbreaking miscarriages, keeping it secret when my grandmother later gave birth to Theo. They wanted Victor to feel no different, no less their son. But the implications hit me like a blow to the chest. If Victor wasn't a blood Blackwell, then, by his own ruthless standard, he had no rightful claim to the inheritance he guarded so jealously. "Does Victor know?" I asked. Theo shook his head. "I don't think so, but Estelle might have. She and my mother were incredibly close. That's why Grant feels so confident. He probably assumes the trust hinges on biology." A flicker of clarity ignited. There must be a clause in the trust requiring blood relation. "Exactly," Theo said. "I've been reviewing it. For principal inheritance, direct bloodline descent is mandatory. Victor was protected by legal adoption until he made this about biology. Now, he might have disqualified himself." The irony was viciously perfect. Victor's attempt to erase me could backfire and erase him instead. "What do we do with this?" I asked. Theo hesitated. "That depends on what you want. What Victor deserves might not be the same as what's best for the family." I let that sit for a moment before replying. "Then maybe it's time people who worship bloodlines are held to their own impossible standards." The morning of the will reading broke clear and cold, autumn leaves blazing like fire across the Philadelphia skyline. I arrived early with Theo, the secret between us burning quietly. Grant Mills sat at the head of the long dining table, leather portfolio open, while various Blackwell relatives gathered, their expressions polite but wary. Victor sat across from me, flanked by my brothers, his smug confidence radiating like a poison. "Before we begin," Grant said, "I must address a delicate matter regarding succession eligibility." Victor straightened, casting me a victorious glance. "It has come to our attention that certain beneficiaries may not meet the biological descent requirements of the original Blackwell family trust," Grant continued. My mother reached beneath the table and gripped my hand tightly. "Specifically," Grant added, "Clara's position is in question." Victor seized the moment. "Recent information indicates Clara is not my biological daughter, and therefore she has no rightful claim." He slid a folder across the table toward Grant, oozing triumph. "DNA proof. Under the trust's terms, she's ineligible." Gasps rippled around the room. My pulse roared. We had intended to raise the truth ourselves, but Victor had moved first, armed with test results I had never authorized. "May I ask how you obtained my DNA?" I said, keeping my voice calm. Victor's smile was razor sharp. "From your water glass, at the last family dinner. Quite simple, really." "From your water glass at our last family dinner. Quite simple, really." Victor's smirk was razor sharp, but before I could react, Theo shot forward in protest. "That's illegal. Unauthorized DNA testing." "Irrelevant to the inheritance," Grant interrupted coolly. "The science is sound, regardless of the method." I felt the strategy we'd so carefully crafted begin to splinter. If Grant accepted Victor's stolen evidence and dismissed the breach in legality, our timing, our voice, our truth would be swept aside. But I had come prepared. "I have additional evidence pertinent to the bloodline question," I said, my tone firm as I pulled our own results from my bag. "This DNA confirms Theo Blackwell is my biological father." Gasps rose around the room, a ripple of shock that broke the illusion Victor had tried so hard to maintain. His face twisted in rage as he turned toward my mother, who met his stare with quiet defiance. "This changes nothing," Grant insisted after scanning the report.
The trust refers to blood from Estelle's direct line, through her son Victor and his legitimate heirs. But that narrow interpretation was the crack we needed. Theo stood, every inch the poised scientist and rightful heir. Then we should examine the actual wording of the trust. My understanding is it requires direct descent from Harold Blackwell, Estelle's father, not from Victor specifically. Grant hesitated. "What's your point?" Theo's voice cut like steel. "Victor is not biologically a Blackwell. He was adopted as an infant. Our parents kept it private to protect him, but Estelle knew. I have the adoption records and DNA confirmation. He placed a second folder on the table, his calm delivery contrasting the chaos unfurling in the room. Victor paled, blinking rapidly, his mouth opening but no words forming. "That's a lie," he finally roared. "Desperate slander. You're the one who argued that only blood relatives deserve the Blackwell fortune," I said, my voice low but clear. "Are you changing your stance now?" The silence was thick until the doors opened and in stepped Edwin Walsh, Estelle's personal attorney, leaning on a cane, his face pale but alert. "Apologies for my tardiness," he said, nodding to me with a knowing glance. "I believe I'm needed here." Grant's startled expression told us everything. Edwin's return was the collapse of whatever legal scheme had been put in place. "I'd like to review the documents before we continue," Edwin said, settling into the empty chair and spreading the papers before him. Across the table, Victor looked stricken, fear finally creeping into the eyes of a man who had ruled with arrogance for decades. But there was more. So much more. Edwin reached for a sealed envelope marked with the Blackwell crest. Before addressing individual bequests, he began. "I must read a letter Estelle Blackwell instructed me to present if questions of lineage arose." The room stilled, breath collectively held, as the truth Estelle had carried in silence for years was about to be read aloud, for everyone to hear. Estelle's letter, read aloud by Edwin in his steady, unwavering voice, landed with the weight of truth long buried. She had always known that Victor was not born of Blackwell blood, but had been adopted by her and her husband out of love after years of heartbreak. A secret guarded to protect him. And she had always known, from the moment she first held me, that I was Theo's biological daughter. "A grandmother knows her own blood," she'd written. The Blackwell Trust, built on the legacy of her father, required a direct bloodline for principal inheritance, but Estelle, anticipating the very conflict unfolding now, had wisely restructured her personal estate, most of what now passed as the Blackwell fortune, to reflect her true wishes rather than Victor's warped obsession with blood purity. She acknowledged Victor as a son in every way that mattered, but his cruel treatment of me, his brother's child, betrayed a character unworthy of the Blackwell name he had so jealously defended. And by his own logic, by insisting that only blood relatives deserve the inheritance, he had disqualified himself from the very prize he sought to protect. Edwin paused then, fixing his gaze on Victor, whose face had gone chalk pale. In accordance with Estelle's explicit instructions, and the DNA evidence presented confirming both Victor's adoption and Clara's parentage, he continued, the trust assets will pass to Theo Blackwell and his biological daughter Clara. Estelle's personal estate will be distributed according to the specific bequests outlined here. As Edwin pushed forward with the reading, Victor lunged at the documents, panic overtaking composure. "You promised!" he shouted at me. "You said only blood relatives deserve the fortune." I met his fury with quiet resolve. "No," I said. "You said that. I only asked if you'd stand by your word, and you swore you would." The true justice wasn't the inheritance. It was watching his empire collapse under the weight of his own hypocrisy. The aftermath played like a modern Greek tragedy. Victor stormed out of the mansion, railing about legal challenges no one took seriously. Grant Mills followed, his career in ruins after Edwin exposed the concealed adoption records he had helped Victor suppress. My brothers approached, stunned. Eric, always gentler, spoke first. "I had no idea. The way he treated you, it makes a terrible kind of sense now." Max nodded. "You've always been our sister. That hasn't changed." Their sincerity touched me more than I expected. They too had been shaped under Victor's shadow. Maybe, in time, something genuine could grow between us. My mother came next, both relieved and remorseful. "I should have told you years ago," she whispered. I reached for her hand. "You were protecting me," I said, finishing the sentence she couldn't. "I understand that now." But the most meaningful moment came later, in grandmother's study, as Theo and I sat among the shelves and heirlooms of a family legacy we were finally reclaiming. "What will you do now?" he asked, his voice thick with years we'd never get back. "Build something new," I said. "We can't recover the time we lost, but maybe we can create something better going forward." He smiled then, my smile, and for the first time, I truly saw myself in someone. I'd like that very much. We talked deep into the night, filling in missing pieces, building something honest from the ruins of secrecy. And as the fire crackled softly, I felt Estelle's presence surrounding us, steady, fierce, and smiling from beyond. Estelle's wisdom had always been quiet, but unshakable, her foresight precise. She'd orchestrated every detail so that the truth would surface without me needing to wage the battle myself. In the end, it wasn't my confrontation that undid Victor, but the weight of his own arrogance and hypocrisy exposed under the light of truth. For years he had worked tirelessly to make me feel like the outsider, the one who didn't belong, never realizing he was the imposter all along. His downfall wasn't dramatic but poetic. A man undone not by betrayal, but by the standards he imposed on everyone else. The irony settled over me like the final note of a long, haunting symphony. Elegant, inevitable, and enough. And as I stepped away from the ashes of what had been, I looked forward, not just toward a legacy rightfully restored, but toward a new chapter with a father who saw me, wanted me, and never questioned whether I was enough. That, above any inheritance, was the gift Estelle left me: the truth, the justice, and the freedom to begin again.